I wish I knew then what I know now. You ever said that? Maybe a better question is, who hasn't said that? Wish you could go back 20 years and put some money on Apple, invest in Apple 20 years ago, or invest in Amazon 20 years ago. Probably more likely you think about personal decisions you made in your life. It was a job that you took, a job that you didn't take, a house that you bought, a city that you moved to, a relationship that you got involved in, a relationship that you ended. Maybe it was a season of life that you were so ready to be done with, you're so ready to move on to the next thing. And then when you got there, you thought, wow, I wish I would have enjoyed that time that I was so ready to be over with more. Things weren't as bad as I really imagined that they would. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? Well, in a lot of those situations, there's no way you could have known. There's no way you could have known to choose a different path. I mean, you couldn't have known to invest in Apple or Amazon 20 years ago. Or if you did, I want to talk after today's sermon, okay? But you couldn't have known that. You couldn't have known about every job. You couldn't have known about that relationship, or maybe that person would have made that particular choice. But sometimes, for some of those choices, there were people who were warning you about that decision. Somebody said, don't go that direction. Don't make that choice. Don't choose that path. And more likely, there were probably different voices giving you advice. Some saying, make this choice, make this decision, choose this path. Others saying, choose this path, make this decision, make this choice. And you were kind of caught between one or the other. Well, regardless, I think we can all agree that instead of saying, I wish I knew then what I know now, in the future, or what we'd rather say, would be, I want to know now what I'll be glad I knew then. When it comes to choices, when it comes to relationship decisions, finances, career-wise, all of those things. I want to know now what I'll be glad I knew then. And maybe even more wise than that is not just to know it or to believe it, but to act on it. To actually heed that advice, that wisdom. Then we can all agree that our futures will depend on the voices that we heed in the present. Your future will depend on the voices that you listen to, that you believe, and then you act on what they say. That will determine your future. But it raises a question. With so many choices, with so much advice, with so many different people pulling us in different ways, how do we decide who to heed? Which voices do we prioritize? Which do we listen to? Which do we give more credibility, more credence than another? Is it the smartest? Is it the most persuasive? Is it the loudest? Is it the most connected? The wisest? How do we decide who to heed? Almost every day, I get a phone call from an undisclosed number. Usually, well, the number's disclosed, just no name. Usually, I don't answer it. But when I do answer it, someone says, the IRS is about to garnish my wages. Or information about my student loans. I haven't had student loans in 20 years, okay? Or sometimes I get Facebook messages. Sometimes you get this, says, I just got a Facebook message from you, and you didn't send it. And then he says, now copy and send this to all of your acquaintances so to keep you from sending it. We're like, wait a minute, what? Should I heed this voice? Should I listen to this voice? I mean, we're in an election season. We're 2 days away from an election. And the prognosis of what's going to happen in the election, or really even the kind of news that you come across, depends on what channel that you turn to. I mean, it's astonishing. There are totally different news stories on different news channels. And so we are skeptical for good reason. We're skeptical of that phone call, of that advice, of that information, because if you hadn't figured it out, you know it now. Everybody has an agenda. Every voice has an agenda. Every call, every news story, there's an agenda, there's a worldview somebody is pushing. And more likely than not, it's to their advantage that you hear and that you listen to it. And so in this kind of environment, how do we decide who to trust? Who can I trust? Who really has my best interests at heart? How do we decide that? How do we choose that? Well, in a world where there's so much information and there's so much advice and so many influences trying to pull us one way or another, oftentimes using dishonest, or to use a little bit different word, duplicitous. Duplicitous means when there's so much duplicity or dishonesty and deception, we look for authenticity. We look for authenticity in a world filled with duplicity. We look for something real. And sometimes, even if that voice might be not as eloquent or maybe even abrasive and perhaps even offensive sometimes, we get a sense that it's real, it's authentic, and for some reason that's more believable to us. Maybe for good reason. We look for what's real. We look for what's authentic. Sometimes even what's raw, that comes from the heart. Especially when it comes to matters of our future and choosing our future, whether it's for you as an individual, for your family, or even for our nation, for our country. We don't want to hitch to the wrong wagon, our trailer to the wrong wagon. We don't want to be at a place where we look back and say, I wish I'd known then what I know now. We want to heed those voices now. We don't want to be duped. And not surprisingly, Jesus, we see, doesn't want us to be duped either. In fact, Jesus spoke pretty consistently about what voices we should heed and should listen to and what voices that we shouldn't listen to. Jesus was very concerned about that. In fact, he warned about false prophets, false messiahs, or false Christs. He says he knew that his followers were going to face this. There's going to be all kind of different voices trying to navigate them, pull them in different directions. How in the world are you going to thread the needle, walk that narrow path when there's only one really right road, there's so many wrong roads? And so Jesus says, watch out. And this is how you know which voices to heed. Look at their track record. Look at what's in their wake. Look at the fruit. Look at what they leave behind. That's going to give you a good idea. And ultimately, every voice, every influence, everyone that tries to pull us in a certain direction, all of these ultimately measure up, or they are measured against Jesus himself. Because he says, I am the ultimate real deal, and his followers believe that about him. And as a pastor, a preacher, I'm standing up here. I have an agenda. I believe it's in your best interest that you believe what Jesus says about your future. I believe that Jesus tells us now what we'll be glad we knew then. And it's not just about knowing it, it's about obeying it, heeding it, listening and doing what he says. Jesus is very concerned about your future. And I know this because Jesus talked a lot about your future. Jesus talked about the future a lot. And that's always part of the parts of the Bible and parts of Jesus' teaching that are controversial, or there's a lot of different interpretations. That's what we're going to look at this series, The Real Deal. Jesus' teaching at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, where he describes future events. In the context of this teaching it begins in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. This is where we're going to be looking. And Jesus, this is on the week that he dies. Maybe this is Tuesday before Good Friday when he's crucified, and then Easter Sunday and all that. Jesus has been in the temple. He hasn't been exactly received very favorably in the temple, okay? Jesus is going in, he's shaking things up a little bit. He's called those who are in charge hypocrites. They've called Jesus possessed by the devil. And so it hasn't exactly gone well. So Jesus and his disciples leave the temple. And while they're walking along, the disciples are calling his attention to the buildings. Now, anytime you're in a big city and you're from the country, which is where Jesus was up in Galilee, and you go to the big city, you look at the buildings. Whenever we drive to see my in-laws, we drive through Atlanta, and Matthew points at the big Peachtree Tower. He says the rocket ship building. We love to see the big buildings in the city. And so there was no structure in Jerusalem or in all of Israel like the temple. It was magnificent. Herod the Great was a great builder, and he built the temple, and he added this portico and courtyard that was second to none in all that part of the world. And so his disciples were like, look at these buildings. Jesus, though, is not impressed. He said, do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. You better enjoy it now because it's all coming down. It's going to be crashed down. Not one stone left upon another. And their response probably would be like yours. Wow. Okay. So a little bit later, Jesus and his disciples, they cross the Kidron Valley and they go up on the Mount of Olives. This is verse 3. Mount of Olives is directly across from where the Temple Mount is. I've been there. You can sit there, and it's literally just standing right there, that part of the city of Jerusalem. It's a beautiful setting. So you can imagine him looking at this glorious temple. And his disciples come to him, and they got a question. Tell us, when will this happen? When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I mean, if you had 3 years with Jesus, I mean, wouldn't you be asking him that every day? You're like, why did they wait till now? I mean, what's the end going to be like, Jesus? When is it going to happen? How are we going to know? Jesus proceeds to answer their questions. Now, when you look closely, you see that actually there are 2 questions here. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? After Jesus told them that the temple is going to be destroyed, Jesus gives them an answer. Beginning in verse 4, he starts off with a word of warning. He says, watch out that no one deceives you. There's going to be all kind of voices out there. There's going to be all kind of influences telling you this is the way, this is the truth. I'm the one, I'm the Messiah. Listen, many will come in my name claiming I'm the Messiah, and they're going to deceive many. A lot of people are going to be duped. There's going to be traumatic things to happen in the world. They always are happening. Earthquakes, wars, famines, all of these things. And in fact, some of you will be duped. Some of my early followers, some of those who claim to belong to me, they're going to be deceived. He says so in verse 10 and 11. He says, at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. It's not going to be easy to be a follower of Jesus these next few years. Maybe never any time, but especially in these years after what's about to happen. Verse 12, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. That's kind of ominous. Most are going to grow cold. They're going to have other priorities. But the one who perseveres, the one who stands firm to the end, will be saved. The Greek word there is telos for end. It means that what is being fulfilled, what is being spoken of, will actually come to pass to be fulfilled. That end. Not necessarily the end of the world, but what I'm talking about when it comes to pass, when it's fulfilled. And then Jesus goes on to describe the most traumatic event that has ever happened in the lives of the people that he's speaking to. The most traumatic world event in their generation, the most traumatic event that's happened in hundreds of years and will be centuries later. In fact, it's an event that the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, the city of Jerusalem still has not fully recovered from. I mean, you imagine 9/11 for us. You remember 9/11? Many of you do. It happened 17 years ago. Some of you might not. But the Twin Towers came down. The Pentagon was hit by an airplane. There was another that crashed in Pennsylvania. 3,000 people died. You remember how traumatic all that was for all of us? This is 9/11 times 10,000. Okay? This would be like, for us, the whole city of New York, the whole city of D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, the whole northeastern United States just being wiped out. This kind of traumatic event is about to happen. And Jesus is going to give them a clue as to when it's going to happen. You remember verse 3? They ask him the question, tell us, the disciples ask, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Because in their mind, the destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem, that's the end of the world. That must be when the Messiah comes back, or when you come back and your kingdom is established. They keep waiting that this is going to happen. But Jesus is actually separating the answer. He's going to tell them when. He's going to answer the first question before he answers the second. And he gives them a clue. It's almost like an encoded clue. It's like, you know what I'm talking about, but not everybody will know what I'm talking about, okay? And here's the clue in verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, okay? The abomination of desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. And then Matthew, the author, puts in this little parenthetical, let the reader understand, okay? This is what I'm talking, like, if you've read Daniel, if you heard about the abomination of desolation, you know what I'm talking about. For the rest of us, we're like, what? What are you talking about, Jesus? The abomination that causes desolation. And this is actually a referral to something that Daniel predicted that happened 200 years before Jesus was born, where a Greek general by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, this was at the time of Alexander the Great, and the Greeks ruled the whole world. They conquered Judea and Israel. And a Greek general named Antiochus Epiphanes went into the temple. He brought his foreign army into the holy place, okay? Jesus talks about the holy place, which would be the temple, or Jerusalem, even the entire city of Jerusalem. And he set up his standards, and he went into the holy place and sacrificed a pig and sprayed pig blood all over the Holy of Holies. Now, if you know anything about the Jewish tradition, you know that they don't eat pork, okay? Pigs are unclean to them. So to take pig blood, to take a pig into the Holy of Holies and to spray pig blood it's not like a barbecue, okay? This was like a desecration. This was an abomination for them. And they took over the Temple Mount, and it was for 3.5 years they had control until what's called the Maccabean revolt, a group of Jews led by a guy named Judas Maccabeus. They took the temple back from the Greeks, and that was part of the time of Hanukkah celebration, is all associated with that traumatic time in Israel's history about 200 years before Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, something like that is going to happen again. You remember that abomination of desolation with the Greeks? Well, something like that's going to happen with the Romans who come after the Greeks, who are ruling at the time of Jesus. You're going to see a pagan army surrounding the city. When you see their pagan standards, they worship of Caesar, it's a clue that something is about to happen. And when you see that, this is what you do. Verse 16. Then, when you see that, your clue, let those who are in Judea, that's the surrounding country around Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. Get away. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. You don't have time. Run. Run for your life. Verse 19. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Why is it more difficult for them? Because they cannot run as fast, because they are carrying children. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. It's interesting that Jesus tells them to pray for this. It's not like, don't you know, Jesus, when it's going to happen? But it's almost like it's kind of like this is not totally settled. In the winter, the rainy season, it's harder to travel. And on the Sabbath day, not everything is operating at full capacity. There may be more people. There will be fewer opportunities for supplies. It'll be harder to travel. Pray that it's not in these times, because you have to get away. And what's going to happen? What's about to happen? It's going to be so bad that people are going to think it's the end. He says in verse 21, for then there will be great distress. It's going to be awful. Unequaled from the beginning of the world until now. It's going to be the worst this city has ever seen, and never to be equaled again. Maybe never again. Will it be this bad? And so that's why when he talks about that, and a lot of times when we read this, we think he's talking about the end of the world. He's not. He says this is not the end. No. Verse 23. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. It's going to look like it's the end of the world. It's not. Because when the Messiah comes, when the Son of Man comes, he says it's going to be like lightning in the sky. Everybody will see it. And it's going to come at a time when you don't expect. And then he goes to quote the prophet Isaiah, who describes something like the stars falling from the sky and the sun going dark and the moon turning to blood. A prophecy he quotes from Isaiah, again quoting from the Old Testament, something Isaiah said to describe the destruction of the city of Babylon. And Jesus is describing the destruction of another city who has rejected her Lord at His coming. He says God will send angels to the four winds. Another word for angels is messengers. They're going to carry the gospels to the four winds. People are going to hear the good news about Jesus. And so when you see all this, Jesus says, he continues in verse 32 and 33. He says, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. When you see these things happening, you know the time has come for you to do what I'm telling you to do, which is get out of the city. And then he adds one more statement, and this kind of has thrown Bible interpreters off for a long time, or a different one, because they're like, what does Jesus mean when he says this? He says, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So you're like, what? What does he mean? He means exactly what he says. This is going to happen within this generation. Some of you who are alive right now, you are going to be alive when this happens. Well, in the year 70 A.D., the Jews in Jerusalem once again rebel against Rome, the Roman Empire. That seemed to be something that happened over and over again. And that rebellion was based in Jerusalem. And this time, the Roman emperor says, I've had enough. I've had enough of these people who are so difficult to rule, and this city which causes me nothing but problems. And so he sent Titus, his son, who would become emperor later, to lead the Roman army, the fiercest fighting force in the world, against the city of Jerusalem. They surrounded the city, besieged it, such that people were not allowed to come in and out. Those in Jerusalem began to starve to death, and it literally got so bad, it was so horrible, it's hard to even say this. But Jewish mothers and fathers had no food. They ate their children to survive. In fact, it was a distress unequaled before in the history of the city. And Josephus, who was an ancient Jewish historian, estimates that 1.1 million people, died in the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. The city was destroyed. The temple was torn down. There was not one stone left upon another. And if you go back today, all that's left, there's a mosque that's sitting, the Dome of the Rock, sitting where the temple used to stand. And the Jews pray at the Wailing Wall, which is just a retaining wall around where the temple used to stand, the courtyard. No stone of the temple is left standing. But what happened? If you look at the story, the city was wiped out. But the church in Jerusalem, the Christian community in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the home base of the church. James, the half-brother of Jesus, was the leader of the early church in the church in Jerusalem. And when you look at the list of leaders, the list of bishops of Jerusalem, the Christian community survived. There were bishops before 70 AD and afterwards. The Christians survived the Roman assault and siege and destruction of Jerusalem. How did that happen? They survived because they left. They got out. Because Jesus said, when you see these things happening, run and don't come back. In fact, tradition tells us that they escaped to the city of Pella, which was across the Jordan River. They left Judea entirely. They heeded the words of Jesus. Now, this happened in 70 AD. It's historical fact. And scholars estimate that Jesus probably was, we know that he was not born, like there's no year zero. He was not born in the year 1 BC or 2 BC because Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So Jesus was likely born in 5 or 6 BC, which means that his death most likely happened in the year 30 AD. That's the best guess of scholars and historians. Which means the time when Jesus said these warnings and the time that they occurred was 40 years, which is exactly the length of a generation in biblical terms. Within this generation, Jesus said, all these things will happen. You see, they survived. The Christians survived because they heeded the words of Jesus. They lived to tell about it another day. Now, this is actually a point of contention for scholars. Scholars look at this and they see clearly that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. He predicted it before it happened. And so they look at that and they say, there's no way that could have been written before 70 AD. How could he have known about it? But also it's interesting because scholars do agree that the Gospel of Mark, which was the first one to be written, was probably written before 70 AD. How could Jesus have known this? Except that he's the real deal. He's the real stinking deal. And so if they survive by heeding the words of Jesus, this isn't the only thing that Jesus predicted about the future. Okay? Will there be traumatic moments like this in my lifetime? I don't know. I certainly hope not. Is it going to happen in my life? I don't know. Maybe. What should we do? Run for your life. No, just kidding. Okay? No, but your future will be determined by the voices that you listen to, which authorities that you give credence to, which agenda that you adopt. Because Jesus said other things about the future, and if you take everything he said to heart, there are bad things coming, there are worse things to avoid. So if you talk about saying, I wish I knew then what I know now, or I'll be glad I knew then what I know now, if we heed Jesus now, we'll be glad we did then. And I don't know about you when it comes to authorities, when it comes to agendas that I adopt, but I'm going with the guy who died and came back from the dead. I'm going with him. Okay? So, I'll be glad, or I'll want to know now what I'll be glad I knew then. You know what's the most important thing you can know now? It's actually not a what. it's a who. Jesus said there's going to be some on that great day of separation. And we're going to look at this a little bit later. For those on one side, it's going to be very bad. Weeping and gnashing of teeth for all eternity. And for another side, there's the joy, his joy for all eternity. To one side, he says, welcome you who belong to me. To the other side, he says, I never knew you. The most important thing to know is not a what, it's a who. You can know him now. Do you know him? Do you know Jesus? Or is this just a religious game? I'm going to give you an opportunity to know him today as you come to share in Holy Communion. Now, after this teaching, in the next verse, verse 36, Jesus starts to answer the second part of the question. The first question, when will this happen? The second question, what will be the sign of the end of the age? Jesus shifts gears about that day or hour. And we're going to pick up there next week.